Hello. In episode 128 of Airs for Architecture, I spoke to the journalist, scholar and architect Austin Williams about his writing, teaching and his work as director of the Future Cities project.
Airs for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Airs for Architecture. I'm talking today to Austin Williams, architect and scholar. And what else are you, Austin? Perhaps you can be so kind as to introduce yourself.
Well, I mean, I'll stop as scholar. That was quite impressive. I'm architect. I don't practice architecture anymore. I give that up. Journalist, I suppose, more than anything. A generalist is probably where I best fit, which means I have very few skills, but I talk about them quite a lot. I run the Future Cities project, which I've done for 20 years now, which is kind of I hate to call it a think tank. I certainly don't call it a do tank. But I just use it to generate debate, conversations, whether that's through events, publications, talks, films, or whatever it might be. That's and then oh, by the way, I also teach at Kingston University, so that's actually my day job. So I shouldn't forget that, should I?
No, indeed. And is that a full-time job or just a part-time job?
It's a full-time job, but I do it as quick as I can to do the interesting stuff afterwards, or in the evenings or weekends. So I teach part 3 for my sins, which is a really nice course because, you know, when you teach architecture, it's the last course that any self-respecting architectural tutor ever wants to be associated with. So I'm kind of left to my own devices. So people want to talk about aesthetics and tectonics and shadow and form and all that. And I'm talking about contracts and insurance. And people are kind of quite horrified to be seen in my company. So it's kind of quite nice that I'm in some ways on my own, that I can then pretend that the collapse of education isn't really happening, that I'm just in my own glorious utopia.
So where do you come from? Is that a northeastern accent or is that a South Walian accent?
Well, very good. Well, I'm dreading the fact you spotted some northeast. I haven't been there for a while. Yeah, I'm from South Wales, from Porth in the Rhondda. That's where I was born. My dad was a train driver, so I've got no kind of allusions to architecture. And then I went to live in Newcastle for 15 years or so, and that's when I first got my first architecture job in Newcastle.
Where did you study?
I studied at the Bartlett for the first 3 years. It was like one of those kind of amazing experimental years. I remember there's 37 students in my year, and I was the only one whose parents wasn't an architect. So I don't know whether I was the oik that was brought in to amuse the posh kids, but that was interesting, and I got in a few scraps because of it. So I studied the undergraduate there, and then I left as soon as I could. Didn't really kind of get on with the Bartlett mindset, and then took some years out. Thought I'd quit, and then realized kind of you can't quit architecture. Do you know what I mean? Apart from the fact there's nothing else you can do outside architecture. So I kind of went to Birmingham Poly as was, which was great because they did a master's course there on developing world architecture, which I was really interested in. So I did my thesis on Sri Lanka. So it was actually, you know, a very interesting course. And then I went to live in Newcastle. So yes, my accent is probably all over the place, I'm afraid. But now you've mentioned it, I'll probably do some really cod Welsh voice.
You're not related to the Williams of Wales, the Shirley Williams, I assume.
Not the Shirley Williams, no. Evans the voice. No, I'm none of those. No, I'm I don't think we've got anybody famous in our family, to be perfectly frank. But yeah, I mean, I haven't been back to South Wales. I mean, apart from visiting at Christmas, I haven't been back there for 20 odd years. So I mean, remarkable. I've got any accent at all, really.
And how do you teach professional practice? I mean, that's a fairly straight course, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lecture-based course. I think we're the only course in the country that does it via coursework assignments. And I'm not a fan of assignments. I'm a big fan of exams. But actually, I think part 3 is just one of those courses where it works very well. That, you know, we give them scenarios. So I make up scenarios. We have a large, medium, and small scale project, which I make up, and then, you know, we follow the scandals that ensue. on projects using kind of real life experiences. Some things that happened to me, people who fall in trenches and die. What do you do as an architect? That kind of thing. That's always a good one. So we follow them through as they progress. So on a monthly basis, we ask for people to kind of write these short essays based on those scenarios. And then I kind of think using it as a coursework based way of doing it, it's like an accretion of knowledge, and actually it sticks with people rather than the usual cramming exercises that people do. So I think it's kind of quite a nice course.
It sounds really good. Sounds very interesting indeed. I mean, it might have made me do my part 3. I never got them. I, I never made it over that barrier.
That's all right. You avoided all that liability, all that insurance, costs. So well done you.
What were you doing out in China before you came and started at Kingston?
Well, I was way back when. So I was an architect, and I packed it in. I packed it in partly because the health and safety madness was coming in. I mean, it's got nothing on what the health and safety madness is now, but it became bureaucratic. I was a site architect, so I was kind of working on with contractors. And then I worked for the Architects Journal for a while as a journalist, and the Architectural Review. I just kind of strangely got into it. And then I tell you what it was. I was sitting in the office, and my wife sent me an email saying there looks like there's a job in China. Why don't you go for it? So there you go. I applied. I think I was probably the only person that applied. It was for a Liverpool University in Suzhou in Jiangsu province, teaching in English. And I went for 3 years, and I stayed for 6. I had a thoroughly enjoyable time.
And you sort of saw that boom period.
Yeah, 2011 is when I went, and then about 2015, that's when it started to kind of, Xi Jinping's second term started to become a little bit more tense, and you could see it was becoming bureaucratic and a little bit, it lost its excitement in the same way as when we started the department, we were making it up. I mean, I hate to kind of say that now. Many of my students will have thought that we knew what we were doing, but ultimately we were just creating a new course. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, as the department grows and more people come in and it becomes more professionalized, suddenly it loses its excitement. So, it just became kind of a fairly typical bureaucratic Western-based university department with lots of admin, which was not really my thing. Sadly, I came back to the UK and realized the Chinese have got nothing on the UK.
Nobody's got anything on the UK when it comes to bureaucracy.
Exactly.
We are the masters of this. The Future Cities project you mentioned, which has been running for 20 years.
Yeah.
Where did this come from? What's its objective?
Just to cause a little bit of kerfuffle, really. I mean, I started off doing something called the Transport Research Group, because transport 25 years ago was political. It's actually coming back to being political now, but it was, the congestion charge and the car and swampy, all that kind of big road closures. So it was something which I was really invigorated by, not because I'm a petrol head or anything, but because I thought, the car has got 100 years of liberation and freedom of the open road. And I always thought it was a magnificent device. And then all of a sudden, it's suddenly now being heralded as the cause of pollution and death and destruction. So I thought, I'll open up a general conversation. So I started some discussion. Then when it started closing back down again, it becoming a little bit more of a bureaucratic conversation, not bureaucratic, more technical conversation. I kind of widened it out to the Future Cities project because I wanted to talk about urbanism. So transport is in there, but it's also looking at how we flow through towns, what cities are, architecture, planning, urbanism, and what have you. So that was the idea behind it, was just to say the debates are fairly stagnant, or unidirectional, or one track. We were talking just for a few seconds before you started, and you mentioned gentrification, and that always comes with a air quotes bad thing, right? And you think, well, I always thought gentrification was quite a good thing. Lifting people out of poverty and raising the conditions and standards around where people live. I thought that was quite good, but now it automatically seems to be wrong. So it's all these things where I just thought, hang on a minute, like, has my world gone upside? Have I changed, or has the world gone mad? So that's all it was, really, just to kind of open up some debates, have like live debates, face-to-face panel discussions, writings, journalism, or what have you, just to kind of ask some questions effectively. So there's no agenda other than very often in a lot of these conversations, there is no alternative position, or people aren't even thinking about it. So I just wanted to create a bit of a space for it.
And has it been successful? And have you seen it transform over the years, the terms of the discourse? Because I understand what you're saying, say, for example, about transportation. The liberation, my father is from a working class background, and the liberation of the motor car, he saw both sides of it. His family, historically from the Midlands and from Scotland, they were not drivers, they were poor, and their lives were, as he puts it, rather boring, rather insular, and I suppose slightly tyrannized in a way. And the motor car had been this great liberation and remains so, and remains so in my life as well. I think I'm not a petrol head like you, but can see the benefits of it. Has there been, with the Future Cities project, an attempt to kind of, I suppose, look from the other end of the telescope, from within the profession of architecture, to try and see what it is that motivates ordinary people? And by ordinary, I mean simply not architects and city planners and so on.
Yeah.
In what stimulates them and their values.
Yeah, no, I spend most of my time not talking to architects. Why would you do that? We want people who actually understand the world, not impose their own supposition on the world. No, that famous kind of Henry Ford quote, as you were talking there, when he said, "I had to invent the motor car to escape the crushing boredom of a Midwestern farm." Slightly kind of hyperbolic statement, but you get the gist that in order to move, and that idea in America where you could like literally drive from coast to coast just to find a new life, is kind of quite impressive, I think. So, I mean, obviously, the Cities Project, we have very limited influence. I personally have sadly less influence than I would dream of, or I tell my daughter that I have. But I do think that there is an influence in some respects, right? In trying to kind of get some change to the conversation. Now, I'm not in the business of influencing policy. So I don't like universities in the last 5 years have suddenly shifted from being educational establishments to being, how can we possibly get some ref points by getting a policy change and maybe a meeting in the House of Lords where we can flag up as being, aren't we great? So I think that that's all very well and good if you want to do that, but I don't think that actually changes anything at all generally. So I'm more interested in actually trying to encourage a broader conversation. I do it with my students. Where I teach in Kingston, where I hopefully try to explain to them that I want an open-minded conversation. So I don't care if they are environmentalists or they're right-wing or they're left-wing, or I don't care what they are politically. Now, are they good architects? And you can be all kinds of idiots to be a decent architect. But are they open to a conversation? Or are they willing to argue with me and even beat me in an argument? So I think that rather than just mouthing the usual mantra that they've kind of absorbed through their schooling. So I think that being a little bit more open-minded is really what I'm trying to do, which, like I say, just to create a bit of a space for a discussion. Whether that's happened or not, it certainly probably hasn't happened because of me, but I think there is a general mood that people are frustrated. And in the last kind of 6 months, 2 years or whatever of politics, post-COVID, I mean, there's a frustration. Not necessarily always a healthy frustration in society, but people are looking for answers. Some of them are looking for answers in incredibly weird conspiratorial ways, but they are trying to make sense of, my God, the country can't be that bonkers to be actually what's actually happening is happening. So they're trying to kind of create these narratives to try to explain what's going on. So I kind of even quite enjoy that, even though I think they're kind of going down the wrong track. Just that there's more of a broader conversation to ask questions about what is going on without just taking it as an orthodoxy that we have to repeat. That's all.
Yeah. Yes, and in architecture we are a fairly orthodox profession. It's an inherently conservative profession, really.
Well, that's ironic, isn't it? Because we always kind of laud ourselves as being these left liberals, socially concerned, not socially conservative.
I guess so, but the nature of the profession seems to me to be one that is, intrinsically conservative insofar as the terms of its engagement are about its professional knowledge, which is very distinct from, as a mode of thinking, from everyday thinking, I think. I mean, isn't that the point with the professions?
No, obviously the professions are elevated above the hoi polloi, aren't they? Right? It's kind of above the idea that we're held to a higher standard. Also, right? So we can be penalised more severely than Joe Bloggs. But I think that elite conception sometimes can go to people's heads, and it has done. And I think that the conversation about, whether it's the climate literacy, whatever that is, the RIBA is mandating everybody learns that as a fundamental backstop. If you want to, fair dues, right? But I don't think it's got much to do with everyday activities within architecture, or whether you have to learn about EDI, or whether you have to learn about ethics from one perspective. I think that there's a perception from ordinary people that architects are floating above them, patronizing them, mandating how they should behave, rather than just giving them, decent buildings and a good urban environment. So that idea that, now we tell people that car driving is terrible and you should walk and have 15-minute livable cities, right? There's a broader conversation than just architecture, but architects and urbanists are at the forefront of it. And that might be fine, right? I live in North London. I live in Wood Green. It's a 15-minute city, right? Nobody had to mandate that. That's just what it is, right? We all have these little pockets of urban centres. But now that it's becoming a mandated thing that cars are bad, cycling is good, which I've never fully understood why that is the case. But that suddenly becomes, people are offended by being told that, right? I'll make up my own mind. Thank you very much. I thought I lived in a free society. So there's a broader problem within architecture that they are patronizing is too weak a word. There's a patrician element to architectural discourse which covers everybody's lifestyles, right? Every aspect of our lives, which I think is really, really problematic.
It's very much a heritage of a modernist kind of, and I would suggest, and I think when we first started emailing each other, fundamentally imperialist mindset, which is barely surprising when, as a discipline, we still look to those great imperialists like Le Corbusier and Ebenezer Howard as markers of greatness and quality and profound competence.
Well, it's funny because when you were talking about imperialists there, I thought you were going to be talking about the 19th century actual genuine Victorian imperialists rather than modernists who, Vienna secession and all this kind of organization which actually fought against some of the imperial tradition to create a different world. I mean, in some ways, I am a modernist myself. I like to think of myself as a modernist.
What does that mean?
But well, it doesn't mean war. It means post-war. I'm a great believer in the transformative power of humanity to change nature for the better. It means that I'm more than happy to rebel against authority. And so you can see that, the way that the modernist movement in the early days, we aren't talking about, 1900 to 1920 or whatever it is, that idea that you could see an imperial tradition in decline and the need to create something new, that this was a future-gazing, future imaginative organization or movement. The avant-gardist idea that we could actually transform art, literature, we could, use all the technologies in film, the car, as we keep coming back to. All those things became something which were useful devices for humans to take themselves further forward and break the chains of imperial, lordly, peasant, imperial relations, social relations. So that break with the past, I think was progressive. However, with that, and some people have kind of written about this kind of quite widely. Obviously, throwing away all the gains and the benefits of the past is Philistine. So we have to be a little bit careful how we handle it. But I think the way that modernism now has become a catch-all phrase for anything made out of concrete or with a flat roof is just a little bit silly. So there is a distinction between that dynamic moment in history, which lasted for a very short period of time in the 20th century, was lost. And so anybody who calls himself a modernist now, I think, has to do it more of a philosophically than actually aesthetically. See what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, an idea of society, I suppose, or civilization and architectural culture as inherently progressive. That is to say, progressing, which has your experience For example, with the discourse around top-down planning ideas like 15-minute cities, has that not kind of brought that into question? Doesn't it just seem like history repeating itself rather than progress? We're just going round and round in circles.
Well, progress isn't linear, is it? I mean, there's bumps in the road. If you go to your W.H. Smith's in the bargain bin section, you'll find a very good book by me called Enemies of Progress, which is actually a defense of progress, but looking at all those aspects from transport to education to environment to whatever it might be, which are kind of arguing that progress is bad, and that's part, I think, of the real significant shift in the last couple of years. It's gone from being the idea that human impact on the planet has always been seen as a negative one. Do you know what I mean? Like detrimental impact. We always kind of frame these things, humans' negative impact on the world. Whereas obviously, historically, it's always been humans' positive impact on the world. We've created, we transform, we create. And for a creative profession to see creativity as inherently potentially damaging is very worrying. So I thought I wanted to try to strive to argue that progress is essential, right? Again, it's an air quote word, right? Development. We have to make sure that we kind of frame these things so we can know in a secret sect-like way what we're talking about. But I do think that progress, almost by dictionary definition, is a good thing. Whereas there's this kind of idea that what progress has led to is pollution and the war in Gaza and environmental destruction and all the rest of it, rather than healthcare and wealth and living longer and happier lives and more jobs and a better consumer lifestyle. Mm-hmm. So I think that I would rather try to put those positives back on the agenda as a counter to the general mood of negativity. So I'm trying to chip away and have some influence, but I don't know whether I'm not in the lead in the forefront of this. I'm trailing behind, sadly. You know what I mean? That'll be on my tombstone. He tried but failed valiantly.
Austin Williams trailing behind.
Exactly. actually, on my tombstone, I wanted Austin Williams. He wanted more. I thought about it. Yeah, it's sad, isn't it? I thought about this. There you go.
Well, I thought perhaps we could actually, before talking about your 5 critical essays series, which is really fascinating and very engaging to read. You were in the news recently about comments you had made about the turning away from architecture in China, where you'd just been and encountered this kind of, I suppose, dispirited quality in relation to the profession. I mean, maybe before we go into the 5 critical essays, and maybe there is some kind of awkward segue I can make whilst you speak, but I would be quite interested to understand that, because it's something that we've been contesting, obviously, in higher education, as you mentioned at the beginning, is in a parlous state at the moment, and partly of its own making, partly demographic, partly political.
Yeah.
Surprising to hear that it's happening in China too.
Well, I was surprised that it's happened so quickly, because basically architecture, was a marginal activity. It didn't really exist up until maybe the turn of the century, when private practitioners, we were allowed to start again. And by the time I went there, like I say, 2011, there was a significant number of schools of architecture that were starting up as a kind of soft skill based. Engineering was the topic of choice, but it was the topic of choice of the parents of the students. So in China, what you have to realize is they go through what's called the Gaokao, like an A-level test, and they just have to pass that. So they spend 6 years rote learning, sweating to pass that test to get to university. They've never thought for 1 second what they're going to do in university. And a matter of fact, their parents then say, right, go to that university and study engineering, because it's a good job. So some students were rebelling. That's that new cusp in China at the second decade of the century. And we're saying, no, I want to do architecture because it's a bit more fun, but it's a bit engineering, a bit fun. So it was a really enticing time. And then the cranes and the construction activity was phenomenal. So architecture was part of that general celebratory patriotic mood at that time of we're building China. Yeah, it had gone from Deng Xiaoping back in the 1970s say, let's build China to be rivaling the West by engineering. Just build any damn city you want, even if it's crap, right? We'll sort it out later. Just build so we actually have an urbanization to rival the West. And now they're trying to say, well, actually, now we've reached a certain tipping point or turning point, Kuznets curve, where you can now say, let's bring some aesthetic niceness and some parks and some decent aesthetics to our buildings, right? So that's where architecture was really playing a role in China. That obviously was, going along quite fine. And then there was a collapse of Evergrande, which was one of the biggest construction companies in China. It's been very well known for a while that on a capitalist market level, the construction industry is actually being propped up by the state rather than actually having a dynamic of its own. And they're building like 32, 35 million houses every year, right? So it's and people were buying them for investments and for profit. Anyway, that collapse has then had trickle-down effect by really impacting on the rest of the industry, on smaller scale, on steel production, on whatever, and on architecture. And there's a lot of architects now who, when you go to Shanghai, I was saying in the article, you can walk around and think, what's wrong with construction in China? There seems to be lots of buildings being built. But of course, that was 5 years ago. They were on the architect's drawing board, and they don't have much to go on. So there's a general kind of rundown of the industry and people looking for new jobs. Right, that's one thing. But I was trying to say in the article, probably in a ham-fisted kind of way, that in some ways architects were at the forefront of building and designing a modern new China, and that dream, which had really captivated the country, has been let slip, and so young people weren't feeling that sense of duty and perspective to carry on with architecture. To create a better society, beyond the fact that they couldn't get much jobs anyway, and they weren't getting very well paid. That's a standard. Architects never get well paid, but it was a little bit more than that, and it was a kind of almost. I was trying to suggest it was a little bit of a crisis of Chinese confidence in their dynamic of this is China's century, and then people saying, oh, is it? Right? Is it actually? Where's the jobs then? Right? Where's the dynamic? And those students are kind of moving into graphics and AI and digital and all that kind of fancy malarkey that I haven't got a bloody clue about. But so that's that. In this country, obviously, there's still lots of students wanting to be architects. Just a question now as to what architecture is. Just like one big bureaucratic tick box morass of health and safety nonsense. And carbon counting. So it's a slightly different dynamic going on, but equally, it's not really what I'd imagine, an exciting, creative profession to be. So there's distinctions, but there's similarities.
Yeah.
Did I go off track there?
No, not at all. I'm kind of interested. I'm kind of interested also, though, in this idea of sort of central narratives versus everyday life in the field as an architect, say, working in Bakewell, where I used to work, or I don't know, Matlock Bath, or whatever it is, where the institution of the profession itself articulates a certain sort of ideological position, I suppose, certain perspective. But at the scale that most architecture takes place in this country, which is quite small, it's quite domestic in its scale.
Yep.
Do these stories really have any leverage? Are they really important? You've mentioned things like 15-minute cities and carbon counting and so on. Is this the lived reality of architects, or is this just something that I guess people in London care about?
A bit of both. I mean, I think that lots of metropolitan areas. I think if you're living in, the South Wales valleys, you're trying to work out, like as you say, 90% of architects are just doing kitchen extensions and trying to make it. It's a job, right? It's not this kind of highfalutin Norman Foster's change the world kind of thing. It's just basically pay me mortgage. So crack on, right? And they'll just be looking at and the fact that employment law, as we speak today in October, they've just changed employment legislation. That's going to be very worrying for them.
Why? What's happened?
Oh, the government's bringing in legislation. Whether this actually works or not, I don't really know. But that idea that from day one you have employment rights. Now, obviously, from an employee's perspective, that's good. From an employer's perspective, it's slightly different. You can day one demand flexible working, for example. It's quite remarkable. Right. So I will be putting that on my part 3 curriculum. He says, making quick notes. But anyway, so there's there, as you say, there's a lived reality of ordinary people doing architecture as a way of it's just one of their chosen professions, and then there's a high end. But obviously, a lot of the conversation. I mean, you can read the media, the architectural press. You can read Twitter if you so desire. You can go to universities and see what's being taught. You can go to the high end of the professions, and that the conversation is 15-minute cities or environmentalism or carbon or ethics with a single track involved, or the crit, or bullying, or whatever. Right? There's a world of a discussion, which I agree with you. It's kind of fairly marginal to normal people's everyday lives, but it impacts upon it because it colors it. It's a bit like people saying, "Well, you really have to realize that Twitter isn't the real world." But unfortunately, it influences the real world, right? Because the literati and the commentariat, or whatever you want to call it, are the ones on there talking about it. Yes. So I think we have to be mindful of it. And in some ways, my job is to somehow try to discourage people from engaging in that conversation, ironically, and try to kind of undermine some of those arguments, or at least put a counter perspective to challenge it. Again, I've gone off track. So I mean, what was the original question?
No. I think that kind of does answer it in a way. I mean, it's interesting to hear your perspective on it. I want to talk about these excellent anthologies that you have, these 5 critical essays series, and not to go through all of them, but I picked out 3 in my notes to you. One on ethics, one on well-being, and one on beauty. What was the objective? What is the objective with these collections of essays? How do they come about, and how have they been received?
Well, look, they came up. I mean, ironically, it came about in lockdown, and I read a pamphlet. This might excite you. I read a pamphlet by Henri Bernard-Levy. Don't know if he's one of your favorites, but certainly not one of mine. But he wrote a book. It was called something like "The Virus in the Age of Madness," or something along that line, right? And it was a swiftly written piece, because we didn't know how long lockdown and COVID would last. And it was about freedom and free speech. And it was a really interesting little piece. And it was only, 30, 40, 50 pages. And I thought it was like one of those pamphlets that you've read about, where you leave it on the bus so other people can read it, that kind of thing. I mean, and that's the way that before the internet, that's how you disseminated information. And I thought, wouldn't it be good to have a similar type thing, right? That you can just kind of read, pass it on, discuss, and what have you. So that's where it came from. And the 5 critical essays, I just picked 5 because that seemed like an easy number. I wish I picked 4 now, and it's gone through from architecture education as general, the first one, as you say. Then we did the crit, and we did that at the time when the Bartlett School bullying farrago was actually happening, to take a look at what that represented for schools. Then beauty, then ethics, then well-being. So they're kind of topics of the moment. The next one I think will be on EDI, and the one after that will be on tech. But there's a million topics out there that you could kind of pick on, and some of them are generic and some of them are much more narrowly focused. And I think that they are things which, as we were saying earlier, sometimes might irritate. Fred Bloggs, the architect in Cricklewood, right, saying, what's all this about EDI policy that the RIBA is mandating that I have to follow, right? And the ARB are mandating that you have to follow it. Not, this would be nice, right? You have to be diverse and inclusive, which all sounds very nice, doesn't it, right? But you're inclusive by excluding those people that aren't inclusive enough. So it becomes a very contradictory motivation. Anyway, I won't tell you about what that pamphlet's about, because I haven't read it yet. I haven't written it yet. But there's broader conversations around ethics, which I think what struck me, one of the reasons I chose ethics, for example, was that when I was asking my students to write these reports for professional practice in the masters, and I'd say, right, I want to have like one section where you like maybe examine the ethics of what you're doing, yes, and your project proposals. And every single one, every single year, talks about the reason why my building is ethical is because it's environmentally sustainable, right? And you think, right, environmentalism has got maybe 50, 75 years of history, right? Ethics has got 5,000 years of discourse behind it, right? Do you not think you can maybe think of something a bit broader and more exciting, right? So I don't dispute that environmentalism has an ethical dimension. Of course it does. But, I just wanted to talk more broadly about, should I be building it in the first place kind of questions. Again, not from an ethical point of view or a carbon point of view, but from, is it necessary, right? Or should I be building my building in Russia? Or should I be building this theater when I could be building homeless shelters, right? Or should I be building in Africa where there are no buildings? And should I be doing it for free because I can't afford it? Whatever. There's a world of conversations which are just not being had out. And that's what these pamphlets are trying to do. And so they're not giving equal weight to both sides of the argument. I'm taking one side because I think that the mainstream is already got plenty of media coverage. So I'm taking 5 people and giving them a brief to say, right, could you tackle it from this side and try to at least bring a little bit more light and shade into the conversation.
Yeah. And you get, say, for example, your first one on architectural education. I mean, what stimulated that? Because you've got Patrick Schumacher and Amin Taha and others writing in there. What stimulated this? I mean, was it your sort of first encounters with this thing that we've been doing and its failures? Or was there a kind of, it's generally speaking, an interesting topic to think on?
Well, I mean, look, in some ways, all of my Future Cities project stuff is basically actually talking about politics through the prism of architecture.
Okay.
Right. And architecture is an interesting one because it kind of has this kind of many tentacles to talk about housing and to talk about environment, to talk about transport, whatever, right? So you can actually have a broader ranging political conversation using this framework. But architecture education, I think I got involved in that partly because I could see, I was like shocked. So, I mean, to the example you mentioned before, similar example anyway, when I went to China, one of the first kind of months I was there, this student, I'd say, do this drawing or something, right? And the students would come to me and say, should I use a pen or a pencil, right? I say, I don't care, right? Just bloody draw it, right? And then they said, should I do it in a red pen or a blue pen? I said, for God's sake, right? I mean, you're 19 years old, just do the bloody drawing. Anyway, and I like sneakily having a little snigger saying, oh, typical Chinese rote learning. They can't make their own minds up, right? And then 7 years later, I come back to the UK and I was having a very similar conversation with students that they wanted to be told what to do in many respects. And I don't know whether that's universal or whether I'm just over egging one example. But I think that there's young people today are not being given, I feel, the same level of opportunity and freedom of discourse and critical engagement that would have been done 20 years prior or 40 years prior, whatever. So I wanted to try to find out why that was. So these essays are simply just trying to pick a little bit at kind of a counter perspective to what is actually going on or what I perceive to be going on. But I do open it up to 5 essays and, they don't agree with me. I don't necessarily agree with them. I mean, Amin Taha's essay is really excellent. I don't agree with it. Patrick's very often, I don't understand it. But I'm joking. Oh, by the way, I have to quickly plug that Patrick Schumacher, to his absolute credit, is funding the publication of these documents. So they're my baby, but I've negotiated with him to fund them, and he's carried on for 3 years now. So to his credit, but yes, it's to go against the grain. I think to kick against the traces or whatever.
But it's interesting to go back to this issue around ethics. I mean, I wonder whether in that very self-defensive way that the profession has, and I think things like the Sterling Prize for me seem to be an expression of that defensiveness, in which there's a kind of curation of a taste culture and a value system through that. But seems to me, particularly the environmental discourse, in a way insulates architects from actually engaging in more profound issues around ethics itself. There's a technical fix. If we do the technical fix, then we've resolved the ethical import. And obviously, it's not quite true, is it? As we've been sort of slowly unpacking, for example, issues around labor and material usage in car batteries, we're discovering that actually an EV is not inherently a more ethical choice.
Yeah, no, exactly. Matter of fact, you could argue it's unethical anyway, denying people a right to choose. Not that I'm that libertarian about things, but there are ethicists who might argue that by definition it's unethical, not even just the exploitation of people in the developing world. But no, I mean, I think that the idea that there's a broader conversation to be had out. I think I might have overstated my question and forgotten your original question.
No, it's just an interesting question about whether this, to use the example that you use, this issue around, say, for example, ethics as equals environmental thinking is really a way that the profession is kind of insulating itself from actually having to take action and be ethical.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. I tell you what I was going to say was just very quickly, so I'll probably forget the second part now. But in terms of the technical fix, one of the things that I think is happening, and again, this is, I mean, I might be wrong, but the idea that in one of the first 5 crit lessons that we did, which was on the crit, I think, I was trying to look at the idea of judgment. And, as we mentioned before, to be a professional is to exercise judgment. Right. And it might be kind of a deontological kind of framing of the way that you see the world, or it might be more consequential or whatever, right? But ultimately, you are trying to understand and make a judgment call and be held to account by that, right? And if you're wrong, you're wrong. If you're right, you're right. Because people now are in some ways afraid to make judgments, or there's a risk-based, analysis, risk aversion abroad, where people don't want to be seen to be taking on the liability of making a judgment. They then want to have some reliance on a technical, evidence-based framework, that they can say, well, look, I looked at this book or this policy, and this is what it told me to do, right? And that goes a little bit, so it actually negates, it eats away, it's very corrosive of the idea of the individual as actually, a thinking, acting, conscious agent. And for me, it's a very slippery slope that the architects very soon are going to, even though every day architects always kind of put on the table, why aren't we more well respected? Why aren't we getting more pay and more work? And you think because you're actually becoming technocrats, and many more people are now looking at you saying anybody can do that, because all you need to do is get a spreadsheet and an AI crawler to check out all the building regulations, and just you can start from scratch. So I think that architects are actually their own worst enemies in many respects, not realizing that they are eating away at the very thing that they should be celebrating, which is their elevated professional ability to kind of make decisions and stand by them, stand or fall by them. So so the technical stuff, I think, is very, very dangerous. As a matter of fact, in education, there's this new policy which is being introduced. I saw the Universities UK is talking about it, but that idea, how can we now build in future skills? So, we very rarely, I don't know about you, but one very rarely mentions the word education or wisdom or knowledge. And I don't even like the word knowledge, but generally the idea about educating young people is very rarely on the agenda now. It's how do you get them a good job at the end of the day? How do you embed future skills, the skills that we don't even know the society might need, through a technical appreciation of technology? How can we kind of embed that? So everything that we do now is kind of done for instrumental reasons. And people, and so it's hardly surprising that young people are just either fed up or not engaged, or becoming technical wallers, right? Or pad wallers, right? It's a very depressing scenario. There's still, look, I mean, just so I don't sound as if I'm completely some old git, there young people, there are still some incredibly intelligent, bright, engaging young people out there. So don't, I don't want to sound like a complete moron, but
no, there's lots of them, and I get to meet them every day, and that's why I do this job. But
yes.
I mean, this issue around the kind of distribution, the bureaucratization of the architectural profession is also, I think, perhaps a way of, again, insulating ourselves from the obligation of a humanistic individuation and a moral responsibility that comes alongside that, or an agency or willpower, or whatever however you want, a soul, even in the really old way of talking about it. And so you get Grenfell.
Where did that leap happen? I missed.
Well, because if you're relying purely on systems, you've looked through the spec on cladding panels on the outside of a the manufacturer has told you what the spec of these cladding panels is, and you've taken that and you haven't analyzed it properly, and the product itself hasn't been properly tested in the right kind of environment. But no one is making a moral decision individually. Everybody's making a moral decision within the framework of a kind of broadly professional bureaucratic ethic. No one stops at a certain point and says, look, we've just wrapped an entire tower block full of working class people in flammable material.
I didn't think you were going to drag me into the Grenfell conversation. How do I?
Oh, well, you teach professional practice. You can't get away from this.
No, I know. Well, that's partly one of the reasons I didn't want to talk about it, because it's like ad nauseum. But no, look, there's a couple of things things here, right? One is obviously the Grenfell Tower, absolute tragedy, and let that be said. And there are people that were responsible. I mean, as people have pointed out, the final inquiry report points to responsibility rather than blame. So you'll see how that drags on for another couple of years in the responsiveness of the professions. But I also think that it's gone a bit bonkers, right? So Grenfell Tower is the reason why we still talk about it. It was an absolutely horrendous event, which doesn't really happen very often in that way. Now, first thing to say is that there, but for the grace of God, go I, because me and many other architects of my generation specified that kind of material very often, right? Secondly, the idea that architects have to, you do ask Kingspan in this case, or whoever it might be, to say what's the best material for this condition, and they tell you, and they give you a certificate, whether it's a BRE or a BREEAM certificate or a kite mark or whatever it might be, right? And you say, all right, very good, right? Thank you very much. Now, the idea that every single way along the line you have to be so distrustful, I mean, ironically, they should have been distrustful, right? But the idea that you now have to say, right, every person along that chain has to do their own individual checks to make sure that you're now personally, individually confident and don't take their word for it. I mean, apart from the fact that's going to extend the reconstruction phase by 100 times, it's kind of unviable and unfeasible, and it's not going to happen. And since we're talking about the difference between the Zahas and the Metropolitan Elite architects over here and the construction companies who might do it, Fred Blogg's the kitchen extension Waller in Cleethorpes, probably, no offense to Cleethorpes, by the way, but they're probably certainly not going to do it, right? You ask an architect what's a principal designer, or what are the designer duties under CDM 10 years ago, or the Building Safety Act now. I think you'd be very surprised if anybody got the right answer. And I'm still working on it, and I teach it them. So I think that there's a weirdness happening, right, where you've actually got the situation where a lot of people who are living in high-rise blocks who know that if the material has to be stripped off their external cladding, the external facade of their buildings, it's going to cost many hundreds of thousands of pounds, and they may be held liable as the SAP of last resort. They're still saying, well, no, hang on, they're having their building kind of stripped off, right? We've got a similar cladding. Why aren't you stripping ours off? Or we've got a slightly different cladding. People are now clamoring for disruption of their lives, right? Or for an event which is actually quite a rare event. So I mean, and again, I don't, you do have to balance risks in this world. And I'm not suggesting that, I'm not making a complete decision and saying which risk is going to turn into a disaster and which isn't, and how likely that is to happen. But I do think that we do need to have a little bit more caution on the way that we have kind of pointed fingers left, right, and center. We've destabilized the industry. I mean, in the last 2 weeks, there have been major bankruptcies and collapses of construction companies. You've got a Grenfell Tower report inquiry, which is impacting on the building regulations documentation, which is no longer reliable. So you can't even follow the approved document. You've got a conversation where, should you put 2 stairs in or should you not put 2 stairs in? And if you do, should they be close together or far apart? And if you do put a second staircase in on a tower that you've already designed, you're going to lose 1 flat on every floor, which is going to make that building unviable. So the developer's going to pull out, because why would you bother? It's bonkers, right? I don't mind having the conversation, but this is not a conversation, right? This is speedy. I mean, I know it's taken 7 years to get the report out, but it's just become a crazy conversation, and it's left everybody behind, because I can tell you now that even though the RIBA and ARB and the inquiry has said the fundamental aspect of the outcome of this inquiry should be we improve the competence of the profession, you will find that people are more incompetent and unknowledgeable about what they have to do as a result of what's going on than they were 5 years ago. And so I'm simply introducing that as a flip side to the way the conversation is going, where everyone's saying, is it wonderful, we've got this inquiry finally? Yes, but I think there's incredibly damaging and dodgy aspects to it which need to be thought out. Sorry, that was a bit of a rant there.
No, not at all. It's very, very interesting. We haven't got much time left, but I did want to ask about this 5 critical essays on beauty as a sort of flip side to the tragedy that we've just spoken about.
Mhm.
A bit of a naughty topic. Why is beauty a naughty topic? Why did beauty deserve, alongside the crit and all of these kind of, I suppose, serious-minded topics, why did beauty deserve its own pamphlet?
Well, because as you well know, beauty, I mean, apart from the fact that, many architects have striven for it, um, consciously or unconsciously, for a long time. Some have occasionally achieved it in their eyes, maybe even in mine, but generally, there's become a politicized conversation in the last 5, 10 years. And whether that's Roger Scruton and all that kind of crowd over there, or whether it's we like modernist architecture, which doesn't ever think about beauty but just looks at purity. There's an interesting polarization, which I think I tried to do in my little introduction to the article, which is saying that it's all very well saying all these clowns who want to go back to some kind of weird gothic fluting because it's beautiful and handcrafted and William Morris and what have you. And they're kind of left social liberals over here criticizing the rightward shift that beauty represents. And then very often you have conservatives who are criticizing the left liberals for saying actually, the beauty is in the purity of the form, and why we should get rid of all this kind of stonework and have much more simplistic uh, concrete brutalism, or timber, which is the new beauty, isn't it? The material itself is the new beauty. Just build some straw bales, some rammed earth, a bit of bamboo, some timber, and you're quids in. As far as most academics are concerned, and that represents beauty, because beauty then becomes a broader ethical agenda than purely aesthetic. So, I mean, it's neither here nor there what I think is beautiful or whether I think anything's much beautiful, but I wanted to try to engage in that conversation, which is genuinely affecting architecture education and the conversation. Again, not to Fred blogs in, I daren't say Cleethorpes again, but some other region.
Stagnant.
I'll never have a beach holiday again. But yeah, that kind of thing. It doesn't necessarily impact them, but in some ways it does, because it's the framing of the conversation that when you open the magazines now, you will see a different type of building. I mean, ironically, as it happens, just to kind of follow on from the previous thought, I am very kind of fascinated by the fact that living walls and green roofs, this kind of idea of putting plants up the side of your building and on the roof, is never part of the conversation about fire safety. I just thought I'd throw that in.
But this thing with around beauty, it seems to me that the function of this aspect of the Future Cities project is about a reclaiming of a space of discourse, rather than necessarily, as you say, trying to curate a new discourse in and of itself. And that
Yeah.
it's a kind of, I mean, you use the word libertarian. I noticed that you have a picture of liberty behind you,
Yeah.
crushing the bourgeoisie. I mean, what is the politic behind it? Is that, I mean, do you find that this is a political position in and of itself now?
Well, yes, but what is it? I mean, you can't beat a bit of Delacroix. It's not the original Delacroix, I have to say.
No, you.
But liberty leading the people. I'm an Enlightenment, uh, supporter figure. I'm a great believer in the Enlightenment. I mean, as it happens, even though like nobody believes me, I'm of the left. Right. Obviously, the idea, you speak about freedom of speech these days, and everyone thinks you're right. Or, critical of environmentalism, they think you're right. But I've always been on the left. So my position is generally, I won't say where it actually kind of came from, but I've always belonged to left-wing parties, no longer. But yeah, I'm a great believer in kind of combating racism, but challenging the way that it's framed in business strategies, and as I said before, EDI policy or critical race theory. I'm a great kind of critic of that. I understand that we have to solve problems of the environment, but it's not my number one agenda. So when the RIBA tell me that I have to put as my mandatory competency climate literacy, I think, well, actually, maybe fighting poverty and the lack of development has always been my primary concern, over and above environment. And if Africa develops, if the developing world develops, they're going to have to use energy and carbon and concrete and build roads. You know what I mean? And that's what we're going to have to do. So, but if you're a lefty liberal over here, you'll probably criticize that from the start. So I've always been on the left, but you're right. It's more the fact I'm trying to open up a conversation. Fair enough. I have my own, hopefully more subjective agenda, but I don't try to impose that. Like I say, the 5 critical essays are within a framework, but they are diverse opinions, and some of them disagree with each other. I mean, the one on well-being, Patrick Schumacher's final argument is in support of well-being. He's been working on that for a long time, whereas some of the other essays are against it. So I think as long as we can take a conversation piece and challenge it, shake it about a bit, and really kind of introduce some new element to it, or maybe look at it from a different perspective, then I think that's my job is done.
Excellent. It's a good point to finish on. Thank you very much, Austin.
Thank you very much indeed, Ambrose. It's a real pleasure to meet you. Real pleasure.
The future. Time's excuse to frighten us. Too vast a project, too large a morsel for the heart's mouth. Future, who won't wait for you? Everyone is going there. It suffices you to deepen the absence that we are. So said Rilke, and he might be right. But if, like Austin, we start in a corner, maybe we can get there in good shape. Thank you to Austin for taking the time to speak with me, for tolerating my questions. Please see the podcast description for links to his professional profile and to the Future Cities project. And thanks for listening.